everyone, welcome. Today we are doing a fun tag video. We are doing #shoppingfortarot. This I saw originally on the Cusp Tarot channel, which is one of the funniest channels I watch, love it, who was doing a response to LadyKnight of Avalon, who started the tag originally, and I'll leave a link to both videos in the description below. Basically, this tag I think was originally started kind of with the idea that, you know, buying decks and having lots of decks, there's nothing wrong with it, kind of celebrating people who like to have decks and buy decks, which is totally cool, and I consider myself among those people. I did think this was kind of like a fun or interesting video for me to do, so close to having just reduced my collection by nearly half. But I still consider myself someone who loves to have decks, and I'm always still looking at new decks. Like, I like to keep my eye out open, and I love watching unboxings and all of the things. So just because I've reduced my collection size doesn't mean that I'm not a fan of buying decks, I suppose. So I still feel very much like this tag applies to me, and thought it was a lot of fun. So let's just get into it. The first question is, what was the last deck you bought and why that one? So I actually bought two decks together. I only have one to show you though. And it was the Cosmic Woman Tarot and the Empty Cup Oracle. And basically, this might sound terrible, but I bought them because they were on sale. The Empty Cup Oracle I had been curious about for a while, especially after seeing it on Casper's channel, and because I love the Sasarai Beto Tarot, and this is kind of, it's by the same author or creator. So I was curious about it, but I wasn't curious enough to spend big bucks. However, Mel from When My Soul Whispered, who is currently kickstarting her Oracle deck, by the way, go check it out. She did have a business where she was selling indie decks in Australia, which was great, but she decided that that part of her business it was time to end it. So all of the decks that she still had, she put on very, very deep discount. So I picked up two on a really good sale. Basically, I got both for the price of one, more or less, especially if I had to pay, you know, shipping from overseas. It was a really good deal. And I bought the Cosmic Woman because I was curious and thought I'd give it a go, and basically it was the same for this. The Cosmic Woman, though, when it arrived, I knew pretty much straight away that it wasn't for me. The Empty Cup I'm not head over heels in love with yet, but I do want to give a little bit more time. So this was the last deck that I bought. Why? Because it was on sale and I was curious. Question number 2 is, what's your decision process when you buy a new deck? And clearly my decision making isn't always all that complex. I would love to say that I have, you know, strict, I don't know, like spreadsheets of decks, and like I give myself a month before I make a decision and I carefully analyze. I don't have that much forethought about many things in my life, let alone tarot decks. I do have a wish list, which is just kind of like a general list of decks that I'm got my eye on. But a lot of the time, I wouldn't say it's impulsive, it's spontaneous. When I see a deck and I'm curious about it, and I'll watch a few unboxings or have a look at a few images on Instagram, and I kind of have a sense of whether I want to play around with the deck, and if I have some spare cash that I'm kind of, you know, have available, and I'm in the mood for a new deck, and I don't know, I just kind of, my process isn't particularly thorough, I suppose. I can't pretend and say it is. Some decks I'm much more deliberate about, you know, decision making. Some decks kind of sit on that wish list and I come back to and, you know, feel unsure about for a long time. Other decks just pop up on a trading website or on a Facebook group for trade or for sale, and I'm like, hey, that's a deck I've always wanted to try but didn't want to pay full price for. Sure. I don't overthink things too much. I don't know. I don't have a rigorous decision-making process. It's just kind of whatever floats my boat, depending on what I'm doing with my time and my money at any given point. I mean, I do like to think about kind of where a deck might fit in my collection. And I have made a video about my analogy between jeans shopping and tarot deck shopping. So I'll link that below in case you're interested. Where I do like to think about how I will spend my time and how I want to spend my time in regards to my decks. So I suppose that's the main consideration I have of when making a purchase, especially when it's indie and it's overseas and like that cash is really starting to add up. That's probably my biggest decision-making factor, really. But other than that, I have to say I'm fairly spontaneous with decisions around that sort of stuff. Question number 3 is, what are deal breakers in a deck that keep you from buying it? I have to be honest and say I don't have a huge amount of deal breakers. For me, making a purchase of a deck really is just like an emotional one for the most part. I mean, I don't do a huge amount of research on the creator, or I don't even look at all the cards. If in my brief research I find out that the creator is like a total racist asshole or something, or a homophobic dickhead, I'm not going to give my money to that person. If I kind of notice that all of the people are super white and super skinny and just all of that, I'm probably not going to be super interested. Also for me, I've broken my rule a few times, but every time I have, it's been reinforced that pure animal decks just don't tend to work for me. I also am not a huge fan of Marseille, so unillustrated or unscenic pips tend to be like cross something off my list pretty quickly. But ultimately, I don't really have like a set list of things that if a deck ticks one of those things, I cross it off my list immediately. Buying a deck or purchasing a deck really is an emotional choice, because an experience of a deck for me, and whether I connect to it and can work with it, it's intellectual to a point, but really kind of that spark and that flow, it's an emotional experience. So even though I kind of have some ideas of what sort of decks I might or might not like, at the end of the day, you know, there's exceptions to every rule pretty much. And if a deck calls to me, or if I'm just like drawn to a deck, I tend to follow that a lot more than I do, you know, too much of the overthinking. Having said that, I have had a couple of decks where I've gotten them and there's been one card that's just kind of really ruined the experience for me. The main deck that comes to mind would be the Harmonious Tarot. So I've had those experiences where there has been a deal breaker, but for the most part, if something feels right, if something flows, whether I understand that intellectually or not, I tend to go with that. So I don't know, deal breakers would kind of more arise on the spot rather than me having like an awareness or a list preset, if that makes sense. Question 4 is Little White Book or Big Guidebook? Now my opinion on this has kind of changed. I love a big guidebook in theory more than I tend to like one in practice. I've often found the idea of big guidebooks almost overwhelming when I've gotten them. And it's almost been like a barrier more than it has been a helper in a lot of cases. I've learned that in spite of myself, I have a better experience, I think, a lot of the time when I just have a little white book available to me. I do love having that little white book as kind of a reference, just to kind of see where an author's coming from, or just a little jump start or whatever. I love having that available. But I do sometimes find with those larger guidebooks, it's more like, I don't know, I get a bit intimidated, I suppose, sometimes. However, with oracle decks, I do love the larger, chunkier books, because oracle decks, I tend to not be reading in the same way that I do tarot. Oracle, I often want to pull out the book. Like, that's part of the experience, is drawing a card and seeing what comes up and reading through the book. Like, the book is as much of the oracle and the divination as the card itself. So I love a big book with an oracle deck. Question number 5 is, do you have any new deck rituals? How do you break in a new deck? Now this kind of ties into another question later, and that is that I have been known on occasion to do a good old deck interview spread. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but that is, for some decks, a process that I like to go through when I get them. Beyond that, for me, I think it's just about shuffling and kind of just allowing myself to have that tactile experience with a deck and like kind of, I don't know, like physically become familiar with these cards. I don't tend to like go through and look at each card really slowly. I like to kind of have a bit of a flip through and like familiarize myself with the overall vibe of the deck, but I don't like analyze each card before I even start working with it. I suppose going along with the large guidebook, that kind of feels like a barrier for me. Once I kind of start down that road, I get caught up in my head too much, or at least I can. So for me, I found the best way to break in a new deck is to just get in and use it. Ask it some small questions, just get reading with it is kind of the best way for me. The only thing I will do is if I've gotten a second-hand deck, I'll put it in order. And I suppose for me that is the kind of the cleansing process. It's like a reset button. I've spoken about that before. So if it's arrived out of order, I'd do that first. Question 6 is a big one. It's, have you ever been disappointed after getting a deck because it looked or felt different than expected? And bonus question, have you ever been pleasantly surprised by a deck after getting it? This has definitely happened to me. Both of those things have happened to me, but I'm struggling to think of really specific examples right now. The only deck that's coming to mind, and this is going to sound really petty, but it affected me, was the Considerate Cat Tarot, which is one I backed on Kickstarter. Now the sample images and the sample cards in the images online, and this is my own fault, but they were kind of very matte, they were squared and they had white borders. And it's the white borders in particular that I missed. I just felt like the white really kind of brightened up the whole experience of the cards. And just the cards in general just looked a lot lighter online. When I got them in real life, they were still beautiful, but they had like a darker border, which is fine. All of that's fine. I'm not particularly fussy about that sort of stuff. But it was more just the idea that I'd built up in my mind based on what I'd seen on the Kickstarter. They just didn't quite look how I'd imagined them to, and I didn't like them quite as much as I wanted to. On the positive side though, I've had a lot of really great experiences where decks have surprised me in a wonderful way. One deck would be the Fantastic Menagerie. That would probably be the best surprise that I've had, because that was a deck that I just had no idea whether I'd like or not. It was one that I had an opportunity to get. I knew how rare it was, so I jumped on it, but I didn't have any expectation that I would particularly bond with it, and yet it's become one of my favorite decks of all time. So that was a massive surprise in a really great way. Question number 7 we've already touched on a little bit, which is, do you interview decks? And yeah, I do. I've done a video on a deck interview spread. That was the spread that I kind of had put together based on other spreads. So it's not like a thing I invented at all. This is a thing people have been doing for a long time. That spread itself really isn't even one I created. It was just kind of like a mishmash of a few others I'd seen. But that's the one I use. And I think deck interview spreads are great. They definitely helped me a lot when I was first kind of starting to collect a few decks to kind of, I don't know, get a sense of their different personalities, and get a sense of what I wanted from them and how I could work with them. That was particularly great at that point in my tarot career. I do still do deck interview spreads, but definitely not as often. At the moment, it's much more just a desire to jump in with a deck. Question number 8 is an interesting one. It's, do you ever buy decks for a specific purpose and only use it for that one? And I suppose my answer would largely be no, I think. I mean, I often will buy a deck because I can kind of envision myself using it in a particular way. But it's not like kind of this more strict thing of this is that purpose for this deck. I don't feel like it's that prescriptive. I'm much more just like flowy. So I might have a general idea of what a deck might do for me, but I don't really feel like I've ever bought a deck with a really specific thing in mind. I don't know, I'm kind of talking myself around in circles. I suppose my answer really is no. Question number 9 is, do you differentiate between decks you buy for yourself and decks you would use for other people? Again, I suppose my answer is no. I don't read for others as much as I used to, but even then, I would not really buy a deck with the intention of this is a deck just for me or this is a deck just for someone else. Those things happen because of how I experience a deck. Some decks just don't feel like they're meant to be read for other people. Some decks feel like they just really work when I read for other people. So it's not a decision I make beforehand, it's just something that happens organically. And number 10, what is one thing you wish deck creators would do more of, or stop doing? Other than like the really big ones, like just racist shit or cultural appropriation shit or all of that stuff, something I'd love to see more of, especially in the indie field, is like different options for decks. So like kind of like a budget option where maybe the cardstock isn't that great and you don't get a box or a book or something, but then like the more lavish, you know, hard box, fancy book options. I think that would be a great way to kind of mitigate the really kind of prohibitive costs of some of these indie decks at this point. Like some decks can cost well in excess of $100, and that's before shipping. And you know, a lot of people really value, you know, like the gold gilding and the fancy box and all of that hardware stuff, like the luxe quality. But I just think how luxe we're getting is really pushing those prices up. And I don't know, I know that's because a lot of people want it. So I'm not saying people can't do that, especially with Kickstarters. That's a big drive for success, I suppose. I guess I would just love to see more people offering that cheaper option, I suppose. But I've talked for long enough. This was really fun. I love a good tag, and this is quite unlike any other tag I've seen. So thank you so much, LadyKnight of Avalon. a new channel I have found. Thank you. I love tags for that reason, I think more than any other, finding new channels. So thank you for starting this, and On the Cuffs Tarot, thank you for doing it so that I found it. I hope you enjoyed my responses. If you do a response to this tag, feel free to leave a link to your video in the comments below. I might have to approve it, but I will, so I can come and watch your videos too. Before I head off though, of course, a big thank you to my patrons over on Patreon. You guys are the best. Thank you so much. Especially big extra special thank you to Laurie, Lynette Brown and Tracy Timmerman. You guys are the best. If you'd like to join my Patreon, there's a link in the description below. We have a book club, we have a Discord, it's lots of fun. Starts from $1, it's a sliding scale, so you can choose how much you want or can contribute to supporting me. That's my plug, thank you. But anyway, that is more than enough for today. Hope you enjoyed this video, and I will talk to you again next time. So much love. Bye.